good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm founder of the Parent Education Series that is brought to you now by nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are incredibly excited to have with us tonight Dr. Bruce Perry, who is author of the wonderful book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. Please join me, everyone, in a really warm welcome for Dr. Bruce Perry. Thank you, Dr. Perry.
Thank you very much, Charlene. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to spend a little bit of time with parents and educators and others in San Mateo County, which is one of my favorite counties, by the way. I say that because not only am I familiar with San Mateo County from back in the day when I was in college, but our working group has a whole number of colleagues in San Mateo that we've been working with. And we have good friendships and very collegial program development, and we think we're actually doing some help to folks that are in the child protective and mental health systems. And anyway, so I like San Mateo County, and I like the people there. And what I want to talk about, I'd like to talk today a little bit about how important community is in buffering the everyday stressors of life, and how that sense of community that can be created in an educational setting, in a home, in an after-school program, in sports and music and drama, all of the opportunities that we provide for our children as they grow up, whether they're formal organizational experiences or smaller group informal experiences. It turns out that these connections are really the magic that helps human beings develop in a healthy way. This connection to others helps us stay healthy. And these connections to each other really help us heal if we've been, impacted by developmental trauma. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what trauma is and that sort of thing in a minute. But what I'd like to say is that, back in the Bay Area, when I first came to college, I was lucky enough to be assigned to a freshman seminar at Stanford, where the faculty member who led our freshman seminar was a gentleman named Seymour Levine, who is a pioneer in understanding the stress response system in mammals, including human beings. And one of the things that he had discovered, he and his colleagues, was that if you take a little rat pup, little rats that are a couple days old, and you just hold them, you take them away from their litter and hold them in your hand, which is, quite a stressful experience, actually. Imagine, a 63-foot, human picking you up when you're a baby and taking you away from your parent for a little while and then putting you back. That would be a little bit overwhelming. So this early experience with stress leads to a change in the development of that animal's stress response system, so that in comparison to other animals that didn't have that early life stress, their stress response system was very different. And so with that observation, really from the time I was an undergraduate all the way through graduate school, into my neuroscience lab, into my clinical work as a psychiatrist and neurologist, it really made me continually think about how experiences shape the developing brain and what that means functionally. What does that mean for, how we live and function and so forth. So what I want to do is take a little bit of time and talk to you a little bit about the brain, some of our work, and about stress, and a little bit about trauma. And then I want to talk about healing. So I'm going to show slides, and I hope nobody feels too overwhelmed or intimidated by this, but this is a picture of the brain. And for those of you who haven't spent a whole lot of time becoming neuroscientists, which I suspect is probably all of you, One of the things that is very challenging when you're trying to understand human behavior through the lens of neuroscience is that the brain itself is incredibly complicated. It's got a lot of moving parts. And, you can sort of look at a few things to just get just a tiny little glimmer of how incredibly complex the brain is. And, most of you have heard of neurons. Neurons are specialized cells that are involved in communication. And when a bunch of neurons get together and communicate with each other, they can create these networks. And there's thousands upon thousands of networks that allow us to do all manner of things. And so the complexity of the brain is so astounding that every time any neuroscientist or any physician or anybody who's trying to understand things about the brain and then communicate them, even if it's in an academic setting, even if when we're talking to scientist, we always have to resort to simplifying and creating models. And we do a lot of modeling. We make estimates, we make summaries, we distill, we only share a portion of what is out there, in part because the complexity of the human brain is beyond our capacity to understand. And I want to say one thing. I love to say this because I think it's so important, is that all of these models, all the things I'm going to talk about from this point forward are wrong in some way. But they can still be useful, and they can still teach and illustrate a very powerful concept or principle about the way the brain works, about the way the brain changes, about the way people work, and so forth. And so that's what I'm going to do. But first, I want to remind you, look at this. This kind of looks like a brain, right? This looks like this kind of looks right. Yeah, the brain. It's got this top part. Here's the cortex up here, and then it's got all this stuff in the middle. It's kind of whatever that is. And then you have down here the spinal cord and the brainstem. And even though you can see all these component parts and it looks right, this is a model. This is not really true. This is not what the brain really looks like. The brain is not transparent, and there's no colored parts in the brain. So even when you make really sophisticated versions of what the brain looks like or how it functions, it's still a model. And so let me show you the model that we use when we're trying to teach. This is a little bit simpler, right? It's pretty clear. Anybody who looks at this can pretty easily go, well, that's not the brain. That's a model of the brain. But part of what I want to talk about with this model is that if you look at this and start to focus on the organization of these parts that I've put here, this upside down triangle, there's a bottom. And the bottom part of the brainstem has got simpler functions that it mediates. And as you get higher and higher and higher in the brain, you get up into the cortex. Now, here's one thing I want to just say about the cortex. The cortex is the most uniquely human part of your whole body. More unique human DNA is expressed in the cortex than any other part of your body. And so there's no surprise then, or there shouldn't be much surprise then, that the parts of us that are pretty unique, pretty special, the ability to create complex speech and language, the ability to invent the written word, the ability to have this very sophisticated sense of time where we can reflect on the past and we can anticipate the future. Everything that we teach in school, and this is important, every single thing you teach in school really is trying to get to the cortex and provide pattern repetitive activation of neural networks in the cortex. So those networks change and make memory, so that what was once outside of you, what was once in the brain of your math teacher, somehow can get into your brain. And lo and behold, you can learn the quadratic equation. You know, what's once outside the brain of a baby with pattern repetitive exposure to conversational speech, parts of the brain of the baby will change in a use-dependent way. The more it's used, the more words you hear, the more conversation you're engaged in. The child will literally change parts of the middle brain and parts of the top part of the brain, the cortex, and all of a sudden develop the capacity to speak, which is a pretty remarkable thing when you think about it. So one of the really wonderful qualities of the human brain is this amazing malleability, this changeability in response to experience. And so if you practice your piano, your motor movements and sounds, you can literally change the biology of the brain. And if you practice your speech and language, you develop speech and language capabilities. And if you practice throwing the baseball, you develop certain kinds of motor vestibular skills. And this is one of the great qualities of the human brain. So first principle I want to just get across: the brain is organized in a hierarchical way. There's a bottom and there's a top. And as you go from the lower part of the brain to the higher part of the brain, the functions are more complex. That's pretty simple. Now, here's the one piece of complicated stuff I'm going to show you. Now, everybody can learn this. It's not that complicated. I know it's 5:30 in the afternoon, had a long day. You know, you're probably, the last thing you want to do is listen to a biology lecture. But if you just stick with me for 1 minute, I'm going to teach you something that's incredibly important for understanding yourself and for understanding your children and for understanding how to communicate with and better understand other people. So here it is. I'll go slowly. Your brain has this architecture, has this neural architecture, the way it's put together, such that in the lowest parts of our brain, there are these very important neurotransmitter networks. And you've heard of a lot of them: norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. All these important neural networks collectively reach every single part of the rest of the brain, and both directly through the autonomic nervous system by sending nerves out to the body, out to your heart, your lung, your gut, your skin, and by sending hormones out into the body, and also by influencing your immune system. This part of the brain, basically these core regulatory networks, are able to influence every part of your body. And because of that, these systems are kind of the backbone of your regulatory systems, which also are your stress response systems. So the reason it's important to talk about this and understand this is, if you're interested in education, what is your job? Your job is not necessarily to provide experiences that are going to change the pancreas or change bones. Your job is to activate parts of the brain that are going to change speech and language and math and geography and social emotional functioning. And you're trying to provide pattern repetitive experiences that will send signals to higher undeveloped parts of the brain and allow them to organize in a certain way and give a child a functional capability that they didn't previously have. That's the same thing you do as a parent. It's the same thing you do as a coach. It's the same thing you do in therapy. You're trying to help facilitate the right kind of experience in the right dose at the right time in development to unfold and optimize the genetic potential of a person. Now, here's one of the things that's really worth thinking about. Now, as I said before, the way this is organized is you've got this system, and let me get rid of some of this messy stuff here. So if you sense through something you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, all of that information from the outside world, again, very important principle, Everything you see, everything you hear, every element of taking in and interpreting the present moment doesn't go from the outside world directly to the smart part of your brain. It goes down to the lower parts of the brain first. And all the feedback you get from your body about where you are in space, and do I have enough food? Do I have enough, liquid? Am I, do I have enough oxygen? All of the signals that tell you what's going on in your body, and all of the input that tell you what's going on in the outside world, first come to the lower part of the brain. Now, this is important because when it comes to this lower part of the brain, you get incoming threat comes in, and your brain does exactly what it should do, which is, first of all, activate the systems that are going to help you stay alive, but also very important for education, very important for communication. It's also going to activate the systems, deactivate the systems in the brain that you don't need right now. So when you're in the midst of dealing with a saber-toothed tiger pacing out on the outside of your fire, out in the darkness, it's out there, you hear it, you can hear the footsteps and you hear the rumbling growl, and you know that you're under threat. That's not the time to sit back and reflect on the meaning of life or think about the family reunion at Joe's cave next week. You don't want that to distract you from attending to the immediate moment. I don't need to use these parts of my cortex. I need to use these action parts of my brain, because I need to be able to act, and I don't want thinking to get in the way of acting. Now, when you get really threatened, you literally can shut down your cortex to the point where you lose all sense of time, and you are completely driven by reactive and reflexive behaviors. Now, this is a reversible capability that we can activate that, and then we can deactivate that. And every day, most of us kind of go through situations where, let me erase all this distracting stuff. We'll wake up in the morning and we'll kind of have a little bit of arousal activation because we got to get ready in a certain amount of time, and then we got to drive to work. And you still have access to your cortex because you're not completely activated. But then you might actually see a fender bender and realize you're going to be late because of traffic. And then you get later and later, and you get more and more upset because you realize you got a really important meeting and you're going to be late for that. And then you start to think of, what excuse can I use? And then you get more anxious, and you start to have a top-down shutdown. And this happens all the day, every day. People have an activation and a deactivation, activation and a deactivation. Now, the truth is, stress is not the enemy of people. Stress is your best friend. And in fact, a really appropriate, really high quality educational experience involves and requires the creation of moderate, predictable stressors. And this is how we learn. We learn because we have these little challenges. We're exposed to something new. It activates our stress response, but in a moderate and controllable way. And the more we do this, the more we actually have experiences of literally neurodevelopmental weightlifting. We build stronger stress response capabilities. We build resilience. But if we have stressors that are extreme and prolonged, we actually alter our stress response system in a way that makes us more dysregulated, makes us less capable of functioning. Because, as I said before, if you start to change your baseline level of activation, and when you go into, rather than going into work like this, where you're sort of just, have a cortex that's ready for business, if you develop a sensitized, overly reactive stress response system, the traffic that used to just sort of irritate you will literally cause you to melt down and make you dysfunctional at work for the first hour. And so that if you have extreme, prolonged, unpredictable stressors like the people are experiencing right now in Gaza, for example, and like many of the people in the Jewish community all across the world are experiencing right now, this overwhelming, ongoing, sensitizing, sense of doom and fear. This is happening on both sides of this situation, where people are feeling like things are out of their control. It's chronically overwhelming. The doom scrolling and the images and the misunderstanding and the anger, it's making everybody feel dysregulated. And this happened to some degree with a lot of us during COVID. And this happened to my colleagues that had to live through a horrible earthquake in Turkey. And the key to this is that when you have these experiences, it changes the normal, healthy, and proportional internal response that we would have in the face of everyday stressors. So if you have the moderate stressor of having to present to your colleagues at a board meeting, or having to sing in the church choir as a solo, or whatever the moderate stressor is, you can still stay in an active alert state with access to the smartest part of your brain and access to all the words of the song that are stored in your cortex. But if you're sensitized and somebody asks you to get up and sing a song in front of everybody or recite a poem in front of your classmates, guess what's shut down? Your cortex. And you get up and you get so dysregulated, you shut down completely, and you have a full-blown fight or flight response. And a sensitized stress response means that, you're going to have somebody who is going to come into class who is feeling very dysregulated, and they're going to come into class and they're only going to have a fraction of their cortex open for business. And they'll be sitting right next to a kid who had breakfast, who had a good night's sleep, who doesn't feel threatened, who there's no chaos at home, there's no unpredictability about housing, there's stable work, and this child's going to have 85% of his cortex open for business. And the teacher is going to teach to this kid and this kid. And which one of these kids is going to learn something? This child can learn, but this child needs to be regulated. Something has to be done to help their stress response system feel safer and calmer. And when that happens, then that will open up their cortex. Now, I could go on and on about this, as you might imagine. But one of the first things I want to say is that what happens to the brain as it takes in information from the outside world is that it goes through this process of sorting through the incoming information. And as I said before, the first place that gets that information is down here in these lower parts of the brain. So, and this is an oversimplification, and I apologize to any neuroscientists in the audience, because I know this is probably they're ready to vomit by hearing some of this. But as the brain is processing this, the first place that has the option or the opportunity to act on incoming information is the lower part of the brain. And I said this, but I'm going to emphasize this again. This part of the brain cannot tell time. So if you're not going to get a complex interpretation of the experience from this part of the brain, and if the signal is coming in from either from the body or the outside world, if the signal is sufficiently threatening, in other words, if it's a signal of tissue damage, or if it's a signal that suggests bad things, your brain will act even before it processes completely the experience. I'll give you a classic example. Everybody's probably been in the kitchen or been in a garden, and they've touched something that's either hot or sharp, and they've removed their hand before they even knew what it was. This part of the brain reacts even before it interprets what's going on. So this is important for educators. It's important for parents. It's important for partners trying to communicate, is that the first part of your partner's brain that's going to interact with what you're saying and how you're saying it is this dumb part of the brain. And then if it can get past sort of the reactive part of the brain, then there's a second order of processing in the emotional part of the brain. Now, this part of the brain is a little smarter. It's got a little bit more, a few more behavioral options. It deals with more complex stuff, but it's still fundamentally focusing on emotion. And this is actually the first place, if you touched a hot stove accidentally, you would withdraw your finger before you'd actually feel pain. And the pain is felt up here. And then the final place where you process the present experience is in the cortex, where you have access to all of these incredible things about reflecting on the past, comparing it to previous experience, being able to anticipate what the behavior, the plan you're going to act on right now. You can actually anticipate what this might result in. So you kind of do schema testing, but that takes a lot more time than automatically pulling your hand away from a fire. The bottom line is, I want you to, if you walk away from one thing from this entire presentation, you should walk away from the fact that the human brain is organized to act before it feels and to feel before it thinks. And ironically, most of our systems and most of our expectations around children and around our peers are the other way around. We actually design our educational systems with the sort of the false aspirational belief that people have adequate executive functioning. In other words, that their cortex is strong enough and mature enough to allow us to think before we act. But very few people do that. This is why advertising works. This is why nobody has ever been able to, in the history of Target, has ever been able to go into Target and leave with the one thing on their list. You always get more stuff because our brain is filled with these little historical landmines about, ooh, shiny, good, I need that. And you don't need that. You do not need another shirt. How many shirts do you have? You do not need another shirt. So along those lines, what this tells us is that if you really want to get to the cortex, if you want the cortex to be open to hear your argument about any perspective, if you want to change anybody's mind, if you want to put new content in anybody's brain, you have to first connect with them in a way that opens up their cortex. And I don't have time to talk about it, but one of the unique things about the human being is that we're social creatures. We're literally the fundamental neurobiological organization of our entire being is to be a part of a group. We are interconnected in ways that are very neurobiologically powerful. Huge parts of our brain are dedicated to forming and maintaining relationships. And so when we feel safe in the presence of another person, we have a cortex that is open to hear what they have to say. You could tell somebody the secret of life. The secret of life could be coming out of somebody's mouth, but if you didn't feel safe with that person and you weren't regulated, that would not get into your head. You would not, they would not learn the secret of life. And you cannot effectively connect with people unless there's a certain minimal degree of regulation. So again, we have scads of research about this. Education talks about this all the time. Kids that actually eat breakfast in the morning are going to do better on tests. They can put new content in their head faster, and they can get content that's previously stored out more effectively if they're not dysregulated. They're not hungry, they're not thirsty, they're not cold, they're not scared, they're not marginalized, they're not minimized. Then you can help them access and use their cortex. Now, one last thing before we go, because I know this is just to stimulate some conversation. So the final really important and powerful thing that I want to talk to you about this part of the brain, and I don't even know if I have it in these slides, and I probably don't. So I'm going to change slides. I'm going to end this slideshow, and I'm going to bring up another set of slides just to show you something. Remember those core regulatory networks that I talked to you about, that down here, that are so important in sort of making sort of being the backbone of the stress response system? Remember these systems? So they develop in utero, these neural networks, and this grand central station is organizing very actively in utero. And then after birth, your brain is not really, in utero, this is kind of the part of the brain that's organized. And the functions that you have present at birth are simple things like the ability to regulate body temperature, the ability to make the transition from liquid to oxygen for respiration. You have very fundamental brainstem related functions. And then in the early years of, or early months of development, you have these core regulatory networks playing a major role in providing organizing input to higher parts of the brain. In other words, if things happen in utero that make these systems dysregulated, sensitized, abnormal, rather than getting smooth, synchronous input to higher parts of the brain that are developing, you're going to get disorganizing, confusing input to the developing brain all the way through your life if you don't repair that. And again, this is why intrauterine and early life care for infants, which is in large part determined by us taking care of the caregivers, if we don't have policy and practice that provides economic stability, safety, predictability, meets the fundamental needs of the caregivers for these infants, we are not going to optimize the development of their core regulatory networks, which will then result in a cascade of risk that we're dealing with literally for the rest of their childhood and sometimes for the rest of their adult life. So just like Seymour Levine showed early on, in the first, literally into an infant rat pup, stressors led to a cascade of changes in the stress response system that made the adult animal more vulnerable to stressors. In contrast, if we want to inoculate, if we want to give if you will, an inoculating experience to our infants where they get moderate, predictable stressors because they have a present, attentive, and attuned caregiving environment, mom, pop, grandma, auntie, whoever it is that's taking care of them. But if that environment, if that relational environment is consistent, predictable, nurturing, responsive, the core regulatory network of that infant will develop as a reflection of that relational experience. And then those children will be buffered from future stressors that are inevitable in life. But they will have a real good head start with a real minimal input from program, policy, and practice dollars. Unfortunately, even though we have scads of data to show that's true, we really have not put together policy and practice to reflect that. So I made this slide in 1995 for a National Governors Association meeting I went to with Rob Reiner and David Hamburg, who former president of Stanford, where we were trying to convince the governors about the importance of early childhood and brain development. And this slide was probably the most influential slide that we used. Was I just, the night before we presented it, I just put together this estimate of the ease with which the brain can change based upon a whole bunch of factors. And then just an estimate of where we spend money with the intention of changing the brain. And there's this huge mismatch between when we need to be supporting families and when we are. And we still haven't really changed this. About 8 years later, Jim Heckman, a really good economist who got the Nobel Prize in economics, in studying these issues, basically came up with the exact same curve, when he looked at the return on investment of educational programs. And that really, this return on investment is related to investment in early childhood. Now, I'm not going to show you this because it's a little bit too complicated to explain it. Not that you couldn't understand it. I'm just really a really crappy teacher. If I was a better teacher, I could explain it more quickly. But this kind of makes one of the key points that I think I hope you walk away with is that the earliest developmental experiences and the interactions that people have with children end up being the most powerful in shaping who we become. And there's a lot of ways of thinking about this, but the way that I think about it the most important part of this work is that time and time and time again, our research and the work of many, many others demonstrates the importance of the human connection, the importance of being present in a moment, and how these moments of interaction, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, whatever you are, these things literally have physiological impact on the people that you're engaging. So when a child is dysregulated and they're coming to class, right? I remember I showed you that their cortex is shut down. But if the principal greets them at the front door and ultimately makes them feel welcome and included and makes them feel like they belong there, literally that opens up their cortex. And that interaction that the principal has is literally less than 5 seconds. But if it requires that the principal is truly sending an engaging signal. I really want you here. I know you can do it. I'm looking at you. I'm giving you a gentle touch on the shoulder. I'm being supportive. I'm encouraging you. And furthermore, other kids are seeing the principal be this way. When you create these relational opportunities in a household, when you create relational sincerity, relational presence, these moments of interaction with others around us, they're healing, they're regulating, they're rewarding, they're physiologically nutritional. And they literally promote health. They lead to physical health, in decreased risk for physical health problems, social health problems, academic problems, and so forth. And this is the key message. You as a parent, you as a coach, you as a teacher, you are the major intervention. You are the major curricular tool. You are the mediator of the acquisition of cognitive content. It's not the curriculum. Curriculum stuff is easy. It's how these things are conveyed. Even, if you have a bad curriculum, but a good teacher, the child learns. If you have a perfect curriculum and a teacher who can't connect or is too overwhelmed themselves and too disengaged, the child doesn't learn. I say this again and again and again with people that I work with in all kinds of programs all over the world. A good people will get around bad policy. But people that are struggling and disengaged and overwhelmed and disinvested and disrespected and marginalized won't be able to take the best policy or program and make it work. So, all right, I better stop there. I'm rambling. I feel like I'm up on the soapbox. Let me stop sharing and see where we are with questions because I went too far already. Rats. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Dr. Perry, you've got us all thinking. So just kind of to start, I want to ask basically what happened to you? What got you interested in this intersection of being a neuroscientist and psychiatrist studying trauma, particularly in children?
Well, it actually started kind of with coming to Stanford and being in that freshman seminar. And, that research was, for me, just mind-boggling. And for those of you who don't know much about it, the thing that was so interesting to me was that you could have like a minutes long experience at the right time in development, because you could do the same kind of, you could take the animals out if they were a little bit older and the same thing wouldn't happen.
Mhm.
But if you did it at the right time, if it was early enough and you had literally a 5 minute long experience, it literally changed the biology of their brain in a way that was functionally very meaningful. So that was highly motivating for me to study. And I ended up studying it in various models, tissue culture, you know, uh, primates, rats, humans. And when I went into mental health, I was on my way. It's kind of a long story, but psychiatry's got a lot of people that are kind of crazy. And I mean, and I say this with sort of a gentle affection. There's a lot of a lot of goofballs in psychiatry, but there are also a lot of geniuses.
Yeah.
And so I was fortunate enough that my academic grandfather was a guy named Solomon Snyder. And my academic great grandfather was Julius Axelrod. And so there's this pedigree of people, half of whom were psychiatrists, but they're also neuroscientists. And they were literally forging a new direction in neuroscience as much as in anything else. And so exposure to those people, starting with Seymour Levine, was really what motivated my interest in this, just because I thought it was so transformative to understand development, that every single problem out there, people would be talking about substance abuse. And I go, you can trace that back to, these systems in the brain that are involved in addiction. Their set point can be changed by early developmental experiences. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah. And, or if you're interested in Alzheimer's, now turns out the same thing. If you're interested in dementia, early developmental experiences influence the onset and severity of dementia. And so almost anything you looked at, we could sort of trace back to that. So I thought it was very important. And that's kind of why I went into it.
That makes sense to me. I was lucky, like you, to study at Stanford under people where some of these things are new. Like I was in developmental psychology, Eleanor Maccabee and Walter Mischel and all those people.
Yeah.
We really created almost a new field in a way, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I remember I was in, there was the human biology course, right?
Yes.
You
Yeah.
remember that? And
My
it was
brother
like,
was in it.
yeah. And the way it was taught was just amazing. It was taught in narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And in stories. And it was so different from any other learning experience I had.
Yeah.
And I just, the exposure to a lot of the faculty at Stanford was very motivating for me, kind of to think about problems in a different way.
Thank you. Really interesting. So one of the things that you do in your book, and again, everybody, I encourage you to read this book, not just because it's a great book, but because you learn a lot about yourself. You can't help but reflect on what made you who you are. You are very careful to define terms like trauma, like resilience. Can you just briefly tell us why that phrase trauma informed is really not being used correctly in many education settings?
Yeah. So here's, and I always hate, I never like to be one of those guys who's like a know-it-all. It's because they're so obnoxious. But one of the things that, as I was developing as a young academic, that the whole field around trauma was like a desert. Nobody was studying it.
Yeah.
And certainly nobody was studying it from the perspective of neuroscience. And again, I was sort of serendipitous in that I stumbled into one of the first groups that was looking at the biology of post-traumatic stress disorder in combat veterans. And so, but it was a very, very young field at the time. And over time, a big part of what we were trying to do was translate, communicate, educate to people about how important these topics were. And then it sort of like caught fire.
Yeah.
And everybody was talking about trauma, about everything. And pretty soon people were using the language in a way that was not as precise. And, you'd hear people talking about it, that people would want me to go to the Texas legislature and talk to them about test trauma. And I'm like, that's not exactly you want to see trauma? I got trauma,
Yeah.
but taking tests is not necessarily something that I would put in that category. So it became really important for the field to start to have to define what trauma really is. And interestingly enough, the field could not do it very well. And there's a lot of elements to that, but it was really hard to pin down, is the trauma the event? Is being blown up in a building in Gaza, is that the trauma? Well, if you were unconscious when that happened, that event really is not going to have much impact on you. But if it killed your parent when it happened, that's going to end up having consequences that will be to you overwhelming and can be traumatic. And so I kept trying to pull back people to start to think about trauma as an experience or set of experiences that changed the internal capacity of the person, changed the biology of the person's, so that they had a different capacity to deal with stress. You know how I talked about the sort of, that one pattern of stress led to sensitization, where you were tuned up and overly reactive. Now you can get that. You can actually have that happen, and it can be traumatizing if you are a young Black child in a predominantly Caucasian environment, and you're continually getting the signal that you don't belong, you don't belong, you don't belong. And that's an uncontrollable, unpredictable stressor that's chronic, and that will sensitize that child. And so for that child, racial marginalization is traumatic. For a child who has autism, being forced to go do mainstream activities because somebody thinks it's good for him to be included actually can create unintentionally a series of overwhelmingly traumatic experiences, where we think going to the zoo is awesome. Isn't it great to take these kids to the zoo? But if you have autism and you have a hard time dealing with transitions and sensory overload, that experience is horrific. So again, it really has to do, not just the event is part of it, but what the person experiences during the event is another part. And then what are the long-term effects of that on the person? So let's say a child who has autism goes to the zoo, has this horrible, huge activation of his stress response, but then he comes back home and he's made to feel safe and protected and regulated again. The enduring effect of that event may not be long lasting. But if the child had to do something like that every week, that would be not a great idea.
Yeah.
So again, that's why we come up with those 3 E's, right? The event, the internal experience of the person, how do they experience the event, and then the effects. What are the long-term effects? And you really have to look at all 3 of those things.
Another thing, Dr. Perry, that you talk about, and again, as a developmental educator, this is so meaningful, is we always hear, oh, kids are so resilient.
Yeah.
You say they're malleable, but not necessarily resilient. And we're finding that the teens are pushing back. They're like, we're sick of you telling us that we need to be resilient, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And you probably noticed, Charlene, in the beginning of, I can't even remember which chapter, I had a little essay about how how resilience is misused sometimes.
I know, the Nerf ball.
Yeah. And part of what I think happens is, and I'm just going to tell you my experience. So I was involved in the shooting at Sandy Hook afterwards with some of the families and then the system. And part of what happens when there is an event that's so overwhelming like that is that the people that are kind of at ground zero are impacted in an extreme way, and it's going to last for a long time. If your child was shot and killed there, it's not going to go away. But as you go from that to people that knew them, to then people that are neighbors, people in the community, you kind of have this kind of bullseye picture of diminishing risk following a high-profile event. And so what happens to the people that are on the edges of these events is that in the beginning, they're rushing in and they're trying to be supportive, but it's overwhelming to them to sit with a parent whose kid is dead, and you feel helpless, you feel overwhelmed, and pretty soon they start to avoid them, they start to disengage, and then they start to say, we shouldn't focus on the pathology in our neighborhood. We should focus on the fact that we're Sandy Hook resilient. We're resilient. And so all of a sudden what they do is, because it's painful for them, they undo and they compartmentalize the pain that goes with it. One of my favorite professors at Yale when I was there as a training in my residency was as a VA hospital psychiatrist. And he talked about the origin of the VA hospital really came because the public wanted to move on from the horror of the young men who had no arms, faces gone, all the horror that came from World War I. So they decided they didn't want them in mainstream hospitals walking around because it freaked people out. So the solution was to salve the guilt of the system and to basically take care of it. They compartmentalize these people in the VA hospital system.
Never heard
And
that.
even though it was sort of, it can be framed as a good thing and we want to help them, the reality is they were trying to get them out of the mainstream view of the public. So, kind of like Sandy Hook community said, we want to be Sandy Hook resilient. We don't want to talk about the pain that these people are having from this loss. We don't want to talk about gun control. We want to talk about how great people are resilient. And so that's what's happening with a lot of these kids in school. They're saying, oh, let's have a program on kids are resilient. But let's not deal with the fact that they're anxious and they're depressed and they're overwhelmed. And I think I'm glad the kids are pushing back because they're getting gaslighted.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what they say. We need time to heal. We need time to recover. We are not going to bounce right back.
Exactly. And Angie said it just perfectly. Resiliency is frequent, or the language of resiliency is used to avoid those painful empathic moments.
Yeah.
And it honestly, and I can tell you from experience, it sucks. I mean, our work is such that right now we're being asked to sit in the darkness in a way that we're very helpless. There's nothing I can say that can make a parent whose baby was shot to death feel better, but they still want the presence of an empathic person there. And so this is hard for us. It's hard to sit in the darkness with somebody. And because what we're able to do, and because of our experiences, we're able to tell people this is going to end. You are not going to always feel this bad. Mm-hmm. And there'll be a moment in the future when you see some hope and when you get some hope. Mm-hmm. And until then, we'll sit with you. We're not going to leave you. So it's brutal stuff. Brutal stuff. It's tomorrow morning. I've got to talk with a bunch of my colleagues, and I don't tell them. I'm dreading it. I'm like, oh. But if we don't go in and help them, then they can't do their work. And so in this interconnectedness that we can create, mm-hmm. They go sit with these families. We go sit with them. I go sit with somebody who's further away. And what we're trying to do is dissipate the pain, dissipate it through this human network. Mm-hmm. And it works. But a lot of people have a hard time joining that web.
Oh, I can only imagine. So we are getting to the end of our hour, but everybody has written in wonderful questions. Let me just try a few of them. Okay, let's start at the top here. I love this question. She writes, I've read both your books, including The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. You discuss many examples of kids who've experienced big T trauma. But what are your thoughts around people who haven't experienced big T trauma, but still have vulnerable nervous systems and struggle with outside responses to everyday stressors?
That's a great question. And I think it's important, kind of related to what we were talking about earlier about defining trauma. There are a lot of different routes to end up with a kind of overly sensitive stress response system and sensory, management. Sometimes it appears to be genetic. Sometimes it appears to be related to some intrauterine process. And then the hard part is that if you are organized that way, if you're put together that way genetically, or there's some intrauterine thing, and you're born into a family where they're not given help to understand this, then that can lead to this cascade of secondary and tertiary factors that exacerbate the problem.
Mhm.
And this is why we think it's so important to try to help teach about some of these concepts, because whether you are genetically or epigenetically or intrauterine or early perinatal, whatever the combination of etiological factors that may not be conventional trauma, the therapeutic approach is very often the same. You can provide sensory regulatory experiences that help people better manage and better build in a quieter, more regulated stress response system because of the malleability that you talked about in the beginning. The brain is changeable. The very same things, experience can make these systems more, abnormal. And we see this with quote trauma. But we also know that given opportunities for moderate, predictable, controllable activations of these systems that are overactive, they'll get less tuned up, and they can ultimately get to the point where they are neurotypically or sort of proportionally regulated. And then ultimately, if people continue to have these opportunities for healthy developmental opportunities and therapeutic opportunities, they develop resilience and a form of post-traumatic, and in this case, it may not be trauma, but post-sensitized health that can be very, very unique.
It reminds me of, we used to say to the young kids at Bing, is this an ant problem or an elephant problem? And would help them frame, because, when you're 4,
Yeah.
everything feels like an elephant problem, right?
Yeah.
But they could get it. They could kind of get it at that level. So
Yeah. I love that. I like that.
I like it too. Kate, if you're still here, I ask this question at the end of almost every event, but tonight, Dr. Bruce Perry, this question is, I don't know, more important than ever. So after everything that you have seen and heard and witnessed and sat with, what gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is that I see people get better all the time. I just got, literally last night, I got an email from Cindy Donis, who's in San Mateo, and she was describing, they're using a model that we developed, the neurosequential model, and they've been doing it for a number of years. And she had done her annual report to whoever she reports to, and they're using this model, this therapeutic approach that we've developed with youth and children and adults. And she described a case of an adult who had basically been written off and in struggling in many, many ways, who had ultimately gone through a bunch of regulating opportunities, did some equine assisted therapy, did other sorts of things, got kind of guided by this model, the sequence of the way we would recommend treatment. And he's become independent and he's working. And it was somebody who had been in the system for many, many, many years and had really not been given a chance of being much. And so that gives me hope. I really do think that the more we learn about how to tap into the malleability of the brain, the more effective we're going to be at helping people get back on healthier developmental trajectories and heal and that sort of thing. So I'm hopeful because I see that stuff all the time. And I'm also hopeful because, and we talked about this before we started, is that I love history, and I've read history forever since I was a little kid. And one of the things that you see is that just historically, humankind has had fits and starts and 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but the overall trajectory of our species is to be more humane, to be more creative, to be more compassionate, to be better. And we generally come up against problems, and then we problem solve around them. and the solutions are frequently multi-generational solutions. And I think that that's what gives me hope, is that I feel like I'm involved in a transgenerational problem solving process. And so I'm old enough that I've seen huge changes in policy and practice. And I know that, if I will be wildly successful in my life if the work we do changes the trajectory of our field by 2 degrees, because that means in 5 generations, it'll be 30 degrees. And that means good things. So I'm optimistic because I sort of take that perspective.
Well, that was a wonderful answer. And we are going to disagree with you, Dr. Perry, because we think you are a great teacher. So thank you tonight for this wonderful conversation. And thank you, everybody, for all your red hearts and for being here with us tonight. This was just wonderful. We are going to treasure this session, Dr. Perry, and lots of people are going to listen and hear it, and it'll make a difference. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Charlene, for the opportunity.
All right. Take care, everybody. See you again soon. Good night.